Hello! So in this video I'm going to talk about doing modus ponens with complex conditionals, meaning doing modus ponens with conditionals that contain one or more conditionals. So let's just remember, what does modus ponens look like? It says if you have a conditional as one premise and the antecedent of that conditional as your other premise, then you can write down the consequent as your conclusion. So there it is. If you have the conditional plus the antecedent, you get to write down the consequent. Good. Okay, so let's look at some examples of this in English with complex conditionals. So here's an argument. First, if I eat well, then if I sleep well, I will feel good. So that's a conditional. Antecedent is I eat well. That's what the if attaches to. And then the then contains the rest of the sentence. So the then is what the then attaches to. This is the consequent. And that itself is a conditional, which is if I sleep well, I will feel good. Okay, so that's our first premise, a big conditional. Simple antecedent, conditional in the consequent. Second premise is I eat well, and the conclusion is if I sleep well, I will feel good. Well, if we look at this, we see, aha, there's the antecedent of our first premise, and hey, that just is our second premise. So we have a conditional as one premise, and the antecedent as the other premise. Okay, and then if we look at the consequent of our first premise, we see, hey, that's the same thing as the conclusion. So that means, what do we have? We have if antecedent, then consequent is our one premise. Our second premise is the antecedent. And our third premise is, our conclusion is the consequent. So this is modus ponens. Yeah, here it is. If I eat well, then if I sleep well, I will feel good. Oh, I eat well. Well, that's the premise. That's the antecedent. So I have a conditional and its antecedent. And I can write down as the conclusion its consequent, which is if I sleep well, I will feel good. So this is an example of modus ponens with a complex conditional. The antecedent is an atomic sentence. Good. There I have it, and the conditional, and I get to write down the complex sentence, which is the consequent of the premise, as my conclusion. Okay? Let's look at another example in English. So here we have, if my team will lose only if they play poorly, then I'm happy. So that if, between the if and the then, that's the antecedent, and then the then is after the then is the consequent. So the antecedent is, my team will lose only if they play poorly, and the consequent is, I'm happy. Okay, so this time we have a conditional that has a conditional for its antecedent and an atomic sentence for its consequent. So here the complexity is in the antecedent of the conditional, but it's still just a conditional. Okay, here's our second premise. My team will lose only if they play poorly, and I bet you know what the conclusion is. It's, I'm happy. Well, so let's look at this. Again, there's the antecedent of our conditional, and hey, that's the same thing as the premise, as the second premise. So we have as one premise a conditional, and as another premise the antecedent of that conditional. Good. Okay, now the consequent of our premise, that's I'm happy, and that is the conclusion. So what do we have? We have two premises and a conclusion. One premise is a conditional. The other premise is the antecedent of that conditional. They're both the antecedent is complex, but that's okay. We have conditional with complex antecedent, and then we have that antecedent again. And then the other premise, the conclusion, is the consequent of the big conditional. So this too is modus ponens. It's if antecedent, then consequent, premise 1. Premise 2 is antecedent, and the conclusion is the consequent. So this is also modus ponens. It's true that the antecedent, so of our first premise, which is the big conditional, has a complex antecedent. It's a conditional itself. And so our second premise is also a conditional, but that's fine. The point is that they're the same thing. We have a conditional as one premise and its antecedent as another premise. That's what we need, as long as they're the same. Okay, let's look at some examples in the formal system. So we have our the argument on the left. We'll go from left to right. The first premise is if P, then if Q, then R. The second premise is P, and the conclusion is if Q, then R. So one premise is a conditional, and the second premise is the antecedent of that conditional. They match. That's good. Not only that, but if we look at the consequent of our first premise, we notice that, hey, that's the same as the conclusion. So we have as our premises a conditional and the antecedent of that conditional, and then the conclusion is the consequent of the conditional. That's modus ponens. Good. Okay, no problem. We look at our second conditional, we see, well, okay, the second premise is the antecedent of the first premise. The problem is that the conclusion is not the consequent of the first premise. The first premise, the consequent is the whole conditional if Q then R. So what we have to do when we do modus ponens is we have to write down the whole consequent, and that's not what we have as our conclusion. We have R, not if Q then R. So this is not modus ponens because the antecedent of, the consequent of the conditional premise and the conclusion are not the same, and so it's not modus ponens. Okay, let's look at the last example. So if we look at the last example, again, our first premise is the same. We have if P, then if Q, then R. And the conclusion of the argument is if Q, then R. And those match. So that's good. That's part of what we need for modus ponens. We need to have a conditional as one of our premises and the conclusion to be the consequent of that conditional. So that's good. But now if we look at our second premise, we can see that it doesn't match our first premise. To do modus ponens with our first premise, the second premise would need to be P, just the antecedent of the whole conditional. To do modus ponens with this argument, with the first conditional, we need its antecedent. Its antecedent is P, but the problem is that our second premise is if P then Q. So the problem is that if P then Q is not the same as P, and so this again is not modus ponens. Okay, let us look at another example in the formal system. Here we have our, so starting again from left to right, we have if P only if Q, then R. Our second premise is if P then Q, and our conclusion is R. Well, good. So the second premise is the same as the antecedent of the first premise. Note that we've dropped the parentheses on the second premise like we said we can. So those are the same even though the punctuation is missing there, yeah? We don't need those. We don't need the parentheses on the second premise, so we don't have them, but they're still the same thing. It's still the same sentence. The punctuation is just telling us, hey, the antecedent of that first conditional is if P then Q, and then that's what the second premise is. Okay, then we look and say, aha, okay, well, the consequent of our big conditional, that's the same as the conclusion, so that matches. So we have all of what we need for modus ponens. We have a conditional as one premise, we have its antecedent as our other premise, and we have its consequent as our conclusion, and so that again is modus ponens. Now we look at our second example. In our second example, we have the same two premises, so we know that we have a conditional and its antecedent. So that's good. We have the premises work. Now let's look at the conclusion. Well, the conclusion needs to be, the conclusion of the whole argument needs to be the consequent of the big conditional. But it's not the consequent of the big conditional. It's if Q then R, and the problem is that the consequent of the big conditional is R. So the conclusion does not match the consequent of the big conditional, and so it's not modus ponens. Let's look at the last example on this slide. Again, we have the same first premise, if P, then if Q, if P only if Q, then R. And the conclusion is R, so the big premise and the conclusion match. We have a conditional, and it has a certain consequent, and that consequent is also in the conclusion. So that's good, those match. However, if we look at the antecedent again, we see, uh-oh, we have a problem, because the antecedent of the big conditional is if P then Q, but our other premise is only P. So we don't have the right premises. Premises we need to have if antecedent then consequent, it needs to be one premise, and the other premise needs to be antecedent, but we don't have that. Here we have the antecedent is if P then Q, and the other premise is just P. So those are not the same, and so this again is not modus ponens. Okay, one more example, and we're done with this video. So here we have a big conditional. If P only if Q, then R only if S. Okay, so this is a conditional. It has a conditional in its antecedent and a conditional in its consequent. Oh, that's a big sentence. But we can handle it. We look at the other premise and we see that it's if P then Q. Okay, and so we see, hey, good. The one of our premises is a conditional, and the other premise is the antecedent of that conditional. Again, we've dropped the parentheses. That's okay. Then we look at the conclusion and we say, aha, it's if R then S. and we compare that with our big conditional, and we say, oh, good, those also match. Yeah, they're the same. So what do we have? We have a conditional as one premise. We have its antecedent as our other premise, and we have its consequent as our conclusion. So this too is what we need for modus ponens. So I hope that these examples have illustrated how modus ponens works with complex conditionals. It's still just if antecedent, then consequent, antecedent, therefore consequent. We just have to see, okay, it's a little bit trickier to see, do we have if antecedent, then consequent, and antecedent? And then did we get the consequent? You have to sort of pay more attention to what those actually are. It's just a little bit more complicated, but that's okay. You can do it. I'm going to do another video that will have some examples of actual derivations using modus ponens with complex conditionals. I think you'll find that really helpful, so I suggest you check that out.